Muslims, Mormons, Unitarians, Oneness Pentecostals, everybody quotes it, but they almost never quote it in context. The Father's greater than I am. What's the context of that? What's the rest of the verse talking about? What's the context of the verse? Jesus has just said that he's going back into the presence of the Father. And he says to the disciples, if you loved me, you would have rejoiced because the Father is greater than I am. So there's a clear context. The Father didn't become incarnate. The Father is not being followed around by Pharisees that are trying to catch him at every word. The Father is not being surrounded by sick people with every kind of disease, trying to surrounding the house that he's in. The Father has not had dust fall down upon his head from people breaking through the roof to drop paralytics down toward him to be healed. The Son has entered into human experience. And so the Father has not become incarnate. And so the Father is in a greater position. He is on the throne of heaven, surrounded by the seraphim and the cherubim. He is not walking the dusty roads of Galilee. And so the Son is going to return back. If you just read a few chapters on, Jesus himself will say in that high priestly prayer in John 17:5, Father, glorify me with the glory which I had with you in your presence before the world was. He does not have that glory. He has laid that glory aside voluntarily to function as the Messiah, to function as the sacrifice for God's people. And so he is going to return back to that glorious position that was once his. And so this is not saying the Father is better than I am. But in a debate, my response back would be, then who is the Son? Because if you are saying that the Father is greater than the Son, do you believe that the Son has eternally existed? When did the Son come into existence? Is the Son going to be interceding for us? How is it that the Son is worshipped by all created things in Revelation chapter 5? So that's why debates are what debates are. Because they don't always, but should at least place both sides in the position of having to answer as many questions as they themselves are asking. Doesn't always work out that way, but it sometimes does, and that's very, very useful.
All right, if they're all equal, why does Jesus say the Father is greater?
Okay, there's clear equivocation, clear error, category error on Mr. Rogers' part. Mr. Rogers' part. That sounds weird. All equal. That does not mean they're all the same. Anyone who can make that objection has not even the beginning of an understanding of what the doctrine of the Trinity is. So if you deny it, but you don't even understand what it is, it's not a good thing. That does not cause people to go, that's a meaningful objection. You're objecting to something you do not understand. We are not saying that the Father became incarnate. We are not saying that the Spirit became incarnate. So if you say, well, they're all equal, then how can one be greater than the other? Because the Son voluntarily entered into human flesh to become the God-man. The Father did not, and the Spirit did not. It's not even an objection. When you raise objections that are not even an objection, that helps the other side. That it really does when people understand what the doctrine actually is.
If they're all equal, this is a separate question. Why doesn't Jesus know the day or the hour? Mark 13:32, he says, only my Father knows. So are they keeping information from him because you don't have the right security clearance, so we know this, but you don't need to know this?
Of course, again, those who have listened to this program, we have addressed this subject as it's been raised by Muslims, by Mormons, by Jehovah's Witnesses, all for different purposes, which is interesting. But again, at this point, if it would be helpful at this point to have a specific confession of faith to understand exactly how an advocate of some type of modalism would find this to be a meaningful objection. And maybe I've misunderstood where he's coming from. It's been a couple of years since I even had heard of the gentleman, and I know we've responded to his stuff in the past. My understanding is that he's some sort of modalist, and so a modalist would have to answer this question as well. And normally the modalist would do it by dividing Jesus into multiple persons, to where the non-divine Son doesn't know, but the other part of him, because he's sort of schizophrenic, so he has one side that praises the other side, and one side knows stuff the other side doesn't know. My response is that just as Jesus laid aside the exercise of a number of his divine prerogatives, including the display of his glory, which was briefly changed on the Mount of Transfiguration when he was transfigured before the disciples, and they saw his glory as he truly was. And yet when they come down from the mountain, that glory is no longer displayed. So there had to be a veiling, a laying aside, a voluntary laying aside. I point out the Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 says that he made himself of no reputation. This is something Jesus did. And so the laying aside of certain aspects of divine knowledge, evidently, for what reasons I do not know, we're not told, was incompatible with Jesus' function as the Messiah. Just as walking down the streets of Jerusalem, glowing with the Shekinah glory of God would have precluded his being able to fulfill the position and function of the Messiah in the way that God intended for the Messiah to live and to die. That would have fit how the Jews would have liked it, but that's not what God's intent.